Urban planning is a political issue. Urban planning is more political than any other livability.
You think it make a difference when a woman is at the decision-making table in the city government? And why is it important to have women shaping urban policies?
It definitely does. It definitely does, and there's a variety of issues why it does. Because women are different consumers of the city, and in order for you to make good decisions for the city, you should have a representation of all types of consumers. So it's not about any movement or any shift in mindset. It's about math, basic logic. If you see cities where you have more women decision makers in city administration, city planning, the difference is huge. How you visit a city and it feels very sad when you don't see kids on the street or when you don't see the elderly. It's not like those people don't exist. They do. I mean, they are there. It's that you haven't built the city that is friendly enough for them to be out. So when we came in the office, there were two things that we were mainly concerned about: having kids experience the city and making it safe. The experience of the city was started with the playgrounds. There was no public playground. So think about it. A city of 1 million had no public playground at all, zero. So we started with a huge public playground. If you lead the city through the mantra that the city is about cohabitation, then all of these other things fall into their right place. So if your main guideline is that we want to maximize what's public, that should reflect on all laws, regulation, and policies that you set forth in urban management. Maybe not just in the local level, maybe just also in the national level, maybe also in the international level. Let's all agree to maximize and be good guardians of what's public, because that's, what a public servant is for, ultimately.
Hello and welcome to The Human City, a podcast where we ask a simple but urgent question. Who are our cities really built for? Cars, concrete and speed, or people, community and everyday life? I'm your host Ruchita Bansal, and every week I sit down with global leaders, thinkers and change makers who are reimagining urban life to be more inclusive, sustainable and humane. Today's episode is very special. We often talk about walkability, sustainability and inclusivity as ideals. But what happens when these ideas are actually embraced at the highest level of city governments? What happens when a mayor or deputy mayor says, we are going to build our city around people and not cars? Our guest today is someone who made that vision real in Tirana, Albania, where walkability, child-friendly streets and green spaces became citywide priorities. I'm honored to welcome Anuela Ristani, former deputy mayor of Tirana, Albania, where she led international affairs and sustainable development. She played a key role in transforming Tirana into a more walkable and inclusive city. From pedestrianizing its central square and introducing car-free Sundays to building neighborhood playgrounds, school street safety zones, and 40 new public schools. Recognized globally as a feminist voice in transport, Anuela argues that representation isn't a slogan but math. Cities work better when women and other everyday users are at the decision table. For India, where walkability and safety still lag, her message is clear. Don't replicate yesterday's mistakes. Make walkability a political choice. So let's dive straight into my conversation with Anuela Ristani. Anuela, welcome to the Human City podcast. It's such a privilege to have you here. To start the podcast, I want to ask you, looking back at your years as deputy mayor, what moments stand out as the most transformative for Tirana and for you personally?
It's so good to be here. I'm really glad to share stuff about Tirana with you and your audience. So it's a privilege. I have been in the city for more than 10 years now. And initially, I was the chief of staff to the newly elected mayor. So after 4 years, I was actually released from that. And I was promoted to deputy mayor. And my job was to really tell the story of Tirana. And that story is based on a sort of like a fairy tale type of narrative, because it came from nowhere. So 10 years ago, if you tell somebody that I'm from Tirana, they're like, Tehran, or, whatever, a city that would sound similar. And now we are proud to say that Tirana is one of these textbook case studies where you can do a lot with very little. But if you have a vision and if you have the political will to shift mindsets and to shift attitudes with regards to how we cohabitate and how we share resources. And that can be not just transformative for the citizens, but also for whoever just passes by. And then the word spreads and then it replicates itself. So it generates more visitors, and then more visitors generate more interest, and then more interest makes it more attractive, and then it becomes more attractive. But if I would have to think back of one moment that was transformative, for sure it had to be the opening of the central square of the city to pedestrians, to making it fully exclusively pedestrian from a roundabout for cars that it used to be before, where if you get in the city, right in the center, in the heartbeat of the city, everybody would first go there and then they would decide where to go. So that roundabout was literally a roundabout where then you would decide which direction you were moving. And what we did was one of the first things here was to basically close it up for vehicles and opening it up for people. And what we thought was an infrastructure project turned out to be a civil engineering project, because the moment the evening of that day where it actually was complete and the gates of the works were moved and then we had a big concert, the way it was populated by everybody who was so thirsty, for that space. It's one of those things that gets me really emotional, because it's like you've kept basic resource, a basic need from somebody who's craving it for so long. And now they can actually quench their thirst. And the desire for public, safe, open spaces is really not an issue of preference, is as basic needs for human beings as water and food and freedom. It is that essential. It makes us equally human as these other things. To realize that this was not just a beautiful plaza, this is not just beautiful architectural work, although it got rewarded and awarded and appreciated in the professional sort of like scene, but it was a basic need, and it was something that was so much desired, and it came. And then when it came, it basically had a life of itself, and people's lives were transformed as a result, because now it's not just the place where you drive by and then decide where to go. It's the place where you actually go. And it had all the standards of anything that one could think of to spend time in a public space without needing to spend money, without needing to have major investment on it. Is basically a public space where you can entertain yourself and do whatever you want to do, whether, listen to music or sit down in a park, in surrounding parks that are there, or have your kids play with a bike or teach them how to ride a bike or whatever, or just like lay down in there and chill. That's the idea of the public space. And to me, I still remember the day. It was the 10th of June 2017. And that to me was really show the power of what it means to give space back to people in a safe and in a beautiful way.
The way you explain it so beautiful. I can understand your emotion. I'm sure it would have been wonderful the day it opened. But getting back to when you said that you closed the roundabout for cars, that wouldn't be so easy. What was the challenges? Because it's very it's something to understand what went in all that.
So yes, you're right. And that is, we only remember the good stuff at the end. Yes, it was a challenge. Once the decision was taken, then we started to do was to basically, without starting the civil works, we organized the days without cars on Sundays. The first Sunday was a disaster, was a complete disaster. Of course, everybody was complaining and traffic was crazy. But what we did was we basically got together all these organizations, schools, sports clubs, everybody, and told them, guys, you have plenty of space. Do whatever you want that you couldn't do otherwise. So you don't have to rent a gym. You don't have to rent a park. This whole area is yours. So people were irritated because they were used to drive a certain way. But then when they saw kids biking, how angry could they be to the kids biking? And then the reason why the road was blocked was not just because, somebody woke up in the morning and said, I don't want you to go this way. I want you to go another way. So we kept repeating that despite the backlash, so much so that after a while, people were demanding to have these days without cars because it was a beautiful occasion for families to spend time together in a safe place without, additional expense, right? You don't have to pay money to get your kid on a bike and then stroll around the city center. So, and then the ones who were driving, they were now in their mind deviating their itinerary. So, finding alternative ways, which were plenty of, to go from A to B in another way. Those who really didn't need to have a vehicle, they just decided to leave their cars. Those who had a bike were finally bringing up the bike. So it sort of like changed the attitude before the works started. There was an understanding that this is how it's going to be. So now let's start planning accordingly. And let's now see this space as a space where we have to go around if we're driving, but that we can use if we're pedestrians or if we're bikers. So yes, it was a process. And the other thing that we did was, other than really just doing it and having people adapt to it, we did a lot of consultation, which meant we explained or we answered questions to everybody who had questions. Because I feel that sometimes we just do things because we know they're right. But the citizens, ordinary citizens, are not supposed to know what's right and they're not trained. They don't have data. They don't have the information that we do at the end of the day as urban administrators or urban planners. So we did that in parallel to the experiential sort of sessions with the days without cars. And once we did that and all questions were answered, of course, not everybody agreed. And of course, it wasn't like you shut down all backlash, but the works kept going and we were transparent with whatever was happening. And they were completed in less than a year, I'd say 10 months from the beginning to the end. And at the end, nobody could say a bad word about it because really it was so beautiful and well received that you really had to be a cynic to not see the good energy that it brought along in the city.
When you mentioned that the car free days, is it only on Sundays or that area is closed totally for cars?
So no, the center city is still like pedestrian. The car-free days now are days where we extend the area where cars cannot. So it's larger than the initial. So now the adjacent roads and stuff. So that's the sort of like the radius is expanded. So yes, we do have car-free days, but mostly, when we have events and when we have things going on in the city that require a lot of closing and a lot of security measures. So in these cases, that radius of closure is expanded, and it's not just the city center, but it's also other roads, and it's always well received. And then if we do not have an occasion, there are certain holidays that we close streets for. There are certain weekends that we close streets for. Again, we have a traffic plan, of course. So it's not just done like a whim. It's done on certain days where it does not disfavor anybody with their normal routine. But yes, it does happen again. And it's a very good tester, especially when we are planning to do partial closure of certain roads or to sort of like narrow the car space in certain roads, which we are doing more often now, especially for the streets that are surrounding the schools, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later. But yeah, so once we start that, so once we know we have a project that will limit either car parking or car lanes and expand that to pedestrian, we start by closing that street temporarily, and we have a street party and we have games and we explain to people what we want to do and so on and so forth. So it is sort of a methodology and it is common practice now.
City governments often prioritize large scale infrastructure, roads, flyover, utilities. But under your leadership, walkability became a big initiative. What influenced you to put walking at the center of Tirana's agenda rather than just more car related infrastructure?
Well, walking in Tirana was always a feature of the city. It was like a symbol. During communism, which was 30 years ago, so not very, very long ago, nobody owned a vehicle. So in Albania, because you could never have private property, all property was public, you could not own a vehicle. And the city was also much smaller. I mean, it was 200,000 people. Now we're talking above a million with, 2 million tourists each month. So there's a lot of, so there's a lot of change in population space and so on. But the walking part wasn't just like a means of transport, was a culture. So for us, going back to that is a little bit more relevant than just, active mobility, which we know, is the best option today for building sustainability in cities and for building sustainable cities. The 15-minute city that, we in our circles of urban development, we keep talking about, that is a very important element of building sustainable cities. But for us, walkability was a thing, was something that made us citizens of the city. So, and not just because we were walking to everywhere. So we're walking to school, we're walking to shopping, we're walking to work, but because we also walked to entertain ourselves. So we call it the Giro, basically just going down and up a boulevard, and that's how you met people. You would sit and chat somewhere on the sides of the boulevard or on the benches, and then you'd get a group of friends, and then you'd see the guy or the girl you were looking for, and you would connect, and you would make friends, and you would fall in love, and you would meet relatives. You'd meet with other people's families. I mean, you would get together and spend time, as it was an entertainment, like the Giro was an institution, let's say. So, because in the absence of other things, of course, I mean, we didn't have the attractions of a modern city in the 80s, but it was something that everybody looked keenly and was fond of. So, unlike most things during communism that were forced, this was pleasure, this was something that we chose to do, and it gave joy to the city. And not just going back to that, but reminiscing about it and experiencing it now, where you have so many other facilities and you have so many other attractions, was also something that we wanted to appeal to. So other than, yes, as urban planners, we know walking is best. As scientists, we know walking is best in terms of health. As environmentalists, we know walking is best, and so on and so forth. Yes, we have that, scientific data showing us that this is the best option. But you also pick up on the cultural elements that make that best option also a lot more attractive than, just telling them or like feeding people information that is more technical and less experiential.
So there's a saying that if you don't see women on the street, you don't see kids. But Tirana has done a lot on child streets agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. The thing with how you visit a city and it feels very sad when you don't see kids on the street or when you don't see the elderly. It's not like those people don't exist. They do. I mean, they are there. Is that you haven't built the city that is friendly enough for them to be out. So the point is, when we came in the office, that was sort of like the same thing. So families will have to drive their kids to places that have playgrounds, spend money on, private establishments where they would have the safety and space to play and to entertain themselves. And that did not happen on the street. Now, we know that if it does not happen on the street, the amount of resources and the time required to sort of like fulfill that need makes it so that you either don't fulfill it enough as it is necessary, or you cut off on other things and in order to invest on spending time outside with your children. And it doesn't have to be that way. So when we came in the office, there were two things that we were mainly concerned about: having kids experience the city and making it safe. The experience of the city was started with the playgrounds. We started by building, there was no public playgrounds. So like, think about it. A city of 1 million had no public playground at all, zero. So we started with a huge public playground by the only park that the city had, which was the lake park. There was huge backlash. These guys are building and, they're destroying the park. The park is wild and we do not want concrete and wood and buildings. And there were no buildings. There was just like a playground. But it was a huge playground for all ages. So from 16, from roller skating to little kids, babies 6 months and up, to a dedicated space for children with disabilities and so on. And then because there was such a huge success, and all sorts of kids were coming, and that was the most popular place for a while. We said, how about we make a deal with citizens? Because obviously, just one huge playground for a city is not sufficient. We want to build as many playgrounds as close to apartment buildings and residential areas as possible. So we're making a deal. If the community finds space, we are going to build a playground. As long as somebody just says, well, I don't need 5 parking spaces, I only need 2, and I'm giving this space to the city. Or somebody else says, I have this huge bar, garden, porch area, and, it's never full. So I'm just, giving half of it to public, then we're building a playground. As long as we find idle patch of land close to apartments or anywhere, we are making a playground / park out of it. And we had a commitment to do that for at least one per month, for every month that we're in office. And we've kept that promise till recently. So we keep building those. And that's how kids came out. Now, the second component was for them to come out and play, but they also had to commute safely, right? So, if you're walking in a city that is so concerned about cars and making them move fast, that's obviously not safe for kids. So there were several things that we did in that direction, which was, first of all, barriers for the sidewalk so that nobody can park on the sidewalk, nobody can jump on a sidewalk, nobody can deviate on sidewalk. That's no, both by enforcing it and by infrastructure. So, even physical barriers. Wherever there was space to enlarge sidewalks, we did that. Making sure that all sidewalks, everything that is new is properly built so it has accessibility for strollers and for people with disabilities. And then it's wide enough so that it meets the standards of, livable and walkable spaces. Children are always running, right? So for those of you who have children, it's always a struggle to keep up with them. It's very difficult to keep up with them if your sidewalk does not meet the criteria of, their energy. So that was, the other element we added in the city in terms of infrastructure. And then we were very much concerned with the schools. The schools are a huge undertaking for us. First of all, we were committed to make sure that all neighborhoods had their school close by in a walkable distance. But not just that, but also make sure that the distance was walkable and the space around the block around the school was walkable. Because we found out that most traffic around schools was not created by people who were coming very far away from the school, but was because parents who were living extremely close by preferred to drive their kids, although it was a block away, to the door of the school instead of letting them walk because it was not safe. So I said, instead of just like doing big things, let's just do a small thing. And the small thing is, let's expand the radius of safety around the school block so that each parent, even if they want to drive their kid, first of all, has a wider perimeter where they can actually drop their children. So it's not just the school door, right? The school gate. It's like the whole thing. And it's safely safeguarded by physical, strong barriers, which in some cases, there are really nice benches because there's these big concrete blocks that kids paint on and they play on. The elderly can use them as benches. And in the off school hours, those are basically park and playground spaces because, it creates such a big perimeter that you can actually play ball in that space between the gate of the school and the street. So not only is it safe for kids who are living really close by to walk and for parents to drop their kids at any point during that perimeter, but also you make sure that that space, which is idle in the off school hours, is a play space. So that's what brought even more kids on the street, more hours, let's say, not just on the street, but like to really be more outside. And then, of course, there's a variety of other things that we did, but like these are sort of like the main infrastructural interventions of taking kids out and having them experience the city.
Yeah, the two interesting things you talked about, that people giving their parking spaces for parks for kids, and other was every neighborhood has to have a school within a walking distance. Now, this is interesting to know that people are actually giving their parking spaces for public parks or space to play for kids. So, is this as part of any bylaw or a policy? How do you make it as an initiative for people to take? That, okay, I am giving my space because they're giving their land. Are they getting something in return?
Public and private property in general is a complicated issue in countries in transition. I dare say not just in Albania, but countries in transition. So a lot of the land, especially if you're coming in a country where everything was all of a sudden public. So even if it was private at some point during like the authoritarian regime, nothing was private anymore. So even if it was yours by generations, that government took it. So there's a lot of dispute on what is whose, but there are certain guidelines that you set forth as policies. So the space in between residential buildings is a public space. You cannot privatize it. You cannot invest on it, despite despite history, whatever. We do a lot of expropriations. If we need to pay money to someone who's really invested on something, but it does not make sense for the public use, we go through expropriation. There are a variety of measures that you have to set in place in terms of major, high level policy, but guided by the principle of maximizing public. That's the definition of a city, right? Our job is not, when we think of, our work as city administrators, and we often confuse it by saying, well, we have to enable economic growth and housing and traffic. In fact, yes, those are main principles. But if you lead the city through the mantra that the city is about cohabitation, then all of these other things fall into their right place. So if your main guideline is that we want to maximize what's public, then yes, you can do a better job at housing. You can do a better job at traffic. You can do a better job parking. You can do a better job at public transportation, because that's sort of like the guiding principle in all the decisions. So in anything, and it's not sufficient to just have that as a vision. That should reflect on all laws, regulation, and policies that you set forth in urban management. Maybe not just in the local level, maybe just also in the national level, maybe also in the international level. Let's all agree to maximize and be good guardians of what's public, because that's, what a public servant is for ultimately. In order to do that, and there's a variety of cases where you negotiate or you give something, take something, a right to develop that is more, let's say, allows for more investments in exchange of getting more space for the public and so on and so forth. A variety of means, but the guiding principle should be to public space, and that's it. And then everything else falls into it. And I have discussion with colleagues, not just here, but internationally, where it's like, we have to house people. Yes, we have to house people, but not if you're using the public space between two buildings. That's not real housing. I mean, that's not, you cannot build just for the sake of housing. You have to build for the sake of living. And yes, we have to consider all the options. So it's not always that straightforward. We have this space that's built because we need housing. We have this space. Let's use it to build more public space. And then, of course, do housing and everything else. But we sometimes just solve problems just like looking at the short-sightedness of the particular problem and not holistically at the development. And our job is to develop, is not necessarily to just solve individual issues. And it's sometimes, not very intuitive, because, our instinct goes into, let's solve this. People don't have housing. Let's do more affordable housing. Great. But does the affordable housing have enough public space as well? Because otherwise it's not housing, it's a prison. So there are certain considerations that or trade-offs that we sometimes think less of. But if we do keep the maximization of the public space as sort of our guiding principle, and then from that everything follows, then that's where you cannot go wrong in any investment that you made, whether it is a new road, whether it is a new neighborhood, whether it is a school, or any public investment has to be led with that principle. And then every private investment has to be guided by that principle through policies and regulations.
The other thing which you mentioned was that every neighborhood has to have a school within the walking distance. So, is it already as part of the bylaws, or is it something you changed later on when you realized that it didn't exist?
So in this city,
Yes.
we have for the last, we couldn't do it from the first years. So I'd say in the last 8 years, we've built 40 new schools, 40, which is huge, which is a huge investment that is a historical investment for any city that you ask. I mean, it's not just Tirana that has modest means, but even big cities. The reason for that was exactly this, because the city was growing, but the growth was not reflecting the availability of the services at the same pace. And schools are the first thing that tracks. And yes, we had new neighborhoods. We had new neighborhoods with like 80,000 citizens and no school and no kindergarten. And no, I'm saying public because, yes, there could be private establishments as well, but public institutions. So for some areas, this was a more difficult exercise than for some others because you have to find, the proper space and the proper setting and enough space. Space is the main word here, but we managed to do that. And yes, this is a principle. It's not in the bylaws. We are now in the national level. We are now setting forth criteria for all major public private developments that they have to have certain facilities. They have to have a certain amount of space for children only. They have to have a certain amount of space for the greenery and so on and so forth. So yes, there are conditions in terms of like the public space that they create, but the schools are a public responsibility. So in that sense, that reflects into the our planning of the urban environment, our own, public investment. And there was a guiding principle, but it is also translatable into urban development and into private development as well. So, whenever, and like I said before, that goes along with negotiating with what is private and what is public. You don't necessarily always have to expropriate. You can also give rights in exchange for give development rights in exchange for, a space or a piece of land that you need for a kindergarten. And we've done that. We've also worked very closely with businesses so that we could assist them into having their own sort of nurseries and kindergartens for employees. So companies who have huge numbers of employees, we assist them through our own staff, through city staff, if they have the conditions or if they can build their own nursery and kindergarten up to a certain number of employees or up to a certain space, if they can keep that space, we then contribute through our expertise and our staff so that we can serve them on that spot, which is, a very smart way to mitigate the need for public schools, kindergartens, and nurseries, but especially for kindergartens and nurseries, and then enables women to go to work, women mainly, and parents to sort of have a work-life balance that is more acceptable.
So, after listening to you, I'm realizing that there might be a lot of community engagement and citizen feedback because without that, it's impossible to do something like this. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the city is organized in 27 initiative units. Each of them serves like a small city hall, a miniature city hall. So they're not investment centers, so they don't manage budgets, but they manage people. So they manage, concerns that are specific to that area. They know people very well. They have social workers that are specially committed to those areas. So they know the families in need who are vulnerable, children in vulnerable situations, women who are, single moms and so on and so forth. But it's the people in the territory. It's like people who are in touch with the communities that are sort of our guiding light into the policies. And this is something that, I mean, we do it on a structured way when we make our budgets, but we also do it in such a continuous way. It's such a habit, of direct communication with the communities that I cannot really say it's as institutional as it is now a cultural thing. where, you know, you need the buy-in of the community for everything that you do. And it's more than a practice. It's sort of like a way of getting acceptance and of getting people involved. And it's also great to safeguard your investment. Why I'm saying that, it's because, and that's why I mentioned before the issue of the parks, of the playgrounds really close to the apartment buildings, because it's easy if you just go and plant an investment somewhere, you know? And it's great, you know, it looks great. You put a lot of money and it's good. But it's more valuable if that investment goes with collaboration with the community. Because, you know, if you have people plant trees in a park that the city is building and you sort of like induce that sort of engagement, then they're gonna look after the park a lot better than, you know, you just going and planting something shiny. If they participate into removing the branches after a storm, they will look after the space being clean, anybody throwing trash at it. If you improve their buildings, and we have these community programs where we're saying, if you want to paint your building, we're going to put half of the money, but you also put half. Or if you want to put up an elevator, we are going to cover half of the cost, and the city and the citizens pay half. And if you are one of the families who is either, you know, in need or is elderly and so on, as modest means, we will also cover for that cost up to, you know, 70-80% of the cost we usually cover for communities that want to improve something in their common space. But you have to have a participant. If we did the 100% investment, and it would really go, it will really deplete in value, not just in physical value because it's less safeguarded, but also in the emotional value, because there's nothing of yours in there. You know, it's just something that was just given to you. Instead, if you're searching for it, if you are investing time and thought and effort, you feel like it's yours. You know, you feel the city being yours if you participate, instead of just, oh, you go and do your thing and we're taking care of this. Then you don't feel like you have to watch over it. But it's impossible for a city to be not taken care of by the citizens and just to be taken care of by, you know, public servants, because there's so much you can do. We cannot have a guard to each bench. We cannot have a guard to each tree we plant. It's impossible unless you have the community's involvement and preoccupation to really conserve, you know, what they built. But they have to feel it like it's theirs. And I think that's the secret ingredient of really making it long lasting.
So you mean to say that if there is any improvement required or any intervention needs to be taken, 80% the city gives and 20% has to become from the people.
Yeah. So if it's about if it's about their own buildings and not the infrastructure, not the outside infrastructure.
Okay, not the public spaces.
No. If they want to improve, their own buildings and the common spaces of their own buildings, like a facade or insulation or stuff like that, we do that. Or add an elevator or stuff like in old buildings that don't have it. We do that. Yeah. No, not the public investment, of course. That would be huge.
So you're mentioning the investment and budget. So, you know, how much of the total budget of the city, the percentage, goes into improvement of walkability and, you know, development of public spaces?
So the city budget is, you mean how, what percentage of
Just
the
the
investment,
percentage.
right? Of the
Yes, yes,
investments go for the public spaces.
yes.
Yes. At least half of the investment goes into infrastructure, of infrastructure in terms of like objects like schools and kindergartens, so on and so forth. And the other half goes into the public space maintenance and investment. Yeah. So like it's half and half. So 50-50 in terms of like the whole, all of the investment budget. And then investment budget in terms of like the city's total budget. Of course, it's, you know, much less than that because the city has 13,000 employees, whose only that sort of is like the biggest sort of item that covers 35%, 36% of the budget's expenditure. And then, you know, the rest goes for maintaining other commitments and fees, and then the social programs, and of course, and then a small part, which up to 20% can be the I mean, not 20, 30% could be investment. Yeah.
Anuela, you have been recognized as a feminist voice in transport. From your experience, what does a truly gender inclusive city look like?
So if I have to depict it, it would be you are out with your friends, you're a young woman, you want to go back home at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're a little bit tipsy and you feel safe. That's an inclusive city for women. So whether you want to take a bus or walk or bike or whatever you want to do, and we're talking about public services here. So what you do with your private budget, it's your own thing. But if you have no means of having a chauffeur or driving your own vehicle, can you have a quality of life? And this is like the maximum freedom that you could have. Walking at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, safely at home, going home safely. That's what a inclusive city needs. And yes, there can be additional elements into this, how you make it more timely. If you're a caretaker, if you are a woman doing more chores through public transportation and public mobility, like we've measured in Tirana, women are the main consumers of public transportation. And not only are they the main consumers, but they are the ones who are having more segments, so more itineraries throughout the day. So not just in terms of volume, but also in terms of diversity. They're doing things, they're getting stuff done through either walking or public transportation. And that has to fit them first. And then the traditional, male who is physically stronger and less vulnerable to possible events in the city. Me personally, I do this. So I walk at night, and I don't live really close to the center. It could be like 35, 40 minutes away, walking. And I prefer to do that, instead of taking a cab or something else. And it's never felt unsafe. And I mean, I'm not saying this is only because the city is working on it, but there are a lot of factors. This is a safe city in general, but that's what we should be working on. And if it's not safe, that's what you should be working on. If the bus is not safe, that's what you should fix. If the street is not safe, that's what you should fix. Lighting is really important as well. And we think that is an infrastructure issue. It's not. It's a mobility issue. If the city is well lit, it allows for more mobility and safer mobility. And the other thing is, how if there's big cities, like huge cities like Cairo, and because they're so huge and they're so swamped with traffic, the city never actually has quiet hours, right? So there's never a street in Cairo that is not always populated. And that eyes on the street, like being able to have your streets visible, walkable, accessible, having windows on the road as well, being able to, have this sight of what's happening there, that is also something that makes mobility gender inclusive. And not just gender, but like human inclusive. It's like inclusive for people. Being in contact, not isolating ourselves in the city. The city is about what's common. This is all us. If we decide to be isolated from the society, cities are not a place to feel lonely. Cities are a place of engagement, of activity, of disquiet in a sense, although we should work on the noise issue, but they are a place of population. They are a place of commonality. I mean, from their inception, people decided it was better to live together than live apart. And that's ultimately, that principle hasn't changed. Countries change, our attitudes change, our lifestyle changes, but that's the fundamental idea. That's what makes us, organized beings and humans.
Being the former mayor for Tirana, you have been the major pillar for the city getting the walking action plan and the green city action plan. You think it make a difference when a woman is at the decision making table in the city government? And
Yeah,
why is it important to have women shaping urban policies?
it definitely does. Um, it definitely does. And there's a variety of issues why it does, because women are different consumers of the city. And in order for you to make good decisions for the city, you should have a representation of all types of consumers. How we design products in the private businesses, in order for you to design a product, you either target that product to a certain segment, or if you want to expand the use of that product, you include all segments to give their feedback on how that product is developed. The city is the same, it has the same idea, except that in the city, there is no choice on who's consuming our product, because everybody should be consuming the city. But traditionally, cities have been led by men, and decisions have been taken by men. And in the past, let's say, half of the century, decisions have been taken by men who were driving to work and wanting to get there fast. Decisions were not taken by women who were staying home with the children and they were having no access to basic services or entertainment. Decisions were not taken by people who had disabilities. Decisions were not taken by single women who had no family but had a more diverse lifestyle. Decisions were not taken by women who were caretakers and not only had to take care of their family but also had to take care of the elderly. Decisions were not taken by marginalized groups who were living really outside the center and could not have regular access to basic services and or only a prerogative of those who could. So in the city context, not only is it important to include women and their perspective, because this is obviously 50% of the population, but it is important to diversify that table of decision makers as much as we possibly can, or at least make sure that the different categories or like the different segments of city consumers are represented proportionately. The easiest thing is to have women proportionately. I mean, and this is true in every industry, in every context. You know, if we're talking about 50% is just a 50-50 thing, then you cannot have a board of 20 men and one woman, because then you're not getting the best of it. Statistically speaking, you are sort of saying okay to less quality of thinking just because 50% is not represented. So it's not about any movement or any shift in mindset. It's about math, basic logic. So yes, it does make a difference. And if you see cities today, and there are studies where you have more women decision makers in city administration, city planning, urban design, and so on and so forth, the difference is huge. I mean, in terms of the quality of life that that city has, in terms of growth that the city goes through. Yeah.
When you look back, what legacy do you feel you have left in Tirana's urban development?
I think that the main thing is that people think more holistically about their quality of life, and they are now able to relate that to the quality of their city. And that is something that I were to explain it to a friend of mine living in Tirana 10 years ago, they wouldn't see the connection. And now they do. So, in terms of where you decide to raise your kids, how you decide to conduct your life, cannot be independent from where you're living. And you are as instrumental to creating that space as anybody else who's responsible for that space in terms of, technical responsibility. So to make sure that you have your quality of life cannot be independent quality of the city if you are living and working and consuming the city. And I think that is something that is intangible, but it's very valuable to make sure that all this boom of development and of growth keeps going. It's not undone, doesn't go undone.
So, which global cities or leaders inspired you during your tenure?
Barcelona initially, and Paris under Anne Hidalgo. And then lots of other beautiful cities. Like I could think of Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain or Glasgow in Scotland, cities that are, make you part of it, even though you're a visitor. You think about it, when you are a tourist, what do you remember the most out of a city? You certainly remember the part where you were walking. You never remember like the taxi or like your commute from the airport. You don't remember much of the hotel or wherever you stayed. You do remember your walk. And I think that all walkable cities are an inspiration for people who work in this, who have this line of work, who want to change their cities. Dublin, everything that is, and it's very funny because when you think of walkable cities, they're not always the ones that have the best weather. And it's ironic how, how the cities that invest more in walkability are the one that we think of as less walkable in terms of weather. So that's not it. If cities that have terrible weather can be walkable and enjoyable, you can imagine cities like Tirana or others, in your side of the world, what great things they can do with it.
If there's one advice which you would like to give to any Indian administrator that they should focus on walkability and improvement of public spaces, what would that be?
So India is growing, and that's wealth. Growth is wealth in all senses, and it's easy for wealth to go and replicate mistakes because once you have wealth, you go after the big stuff, and it's not always the best. So my advice, especially for the cities that are growing and they're building and they're under construction, is the same thing that I said, the mantra of maximize public space and everything else will follow. So, if you can have 5,000 meters square of development or 50,000 meters square of development, and you can squeeze that in order to get more public space, do it now. Because first of all, you're going to reap the rewards much better than if you maximize the development space. You're going to reap the rewards and increase the value of the property multifold. But it's also something that it's very difficult to undo, and it takes decades to undo mistakes that we do in development. So we have the data, we have the experience, we know what's right and how to do it right. So for those who are decision makers, this is what they should enforce. And for those who are developers and want to maximize value, this is what we should teach them. So that's, it's very simple. It's not rocket science. It's just something that we have to accept, evidence that we have to accept, and go with it. Data shows us that places that are walkable do better business, are more visited, are safer, increase economic value. Data shows us that cities that have public space and greenery have a better quality of life, have longer lifespan. All of these things that are ingredients to what is successful and what we ultimately want to achieve. The only difference is that cities that are well established will have a harder time doing it. And cities who are now developing have a golden opportunity to do it right. And I think that, India is the place where this is truer than all other countries. I think there are several countries, but not a lot in the northern hemisphere who are growing. And we should capitalize on that. And then again, in the southern hemisphere where it's growing a lot more at a huger pace, that's where we should really try and share our knowledge and make it right. Because, it's an opportunity that it's a pity to miss it. It's not a small mistake. It's a huge mistake if we don't build our cities through this principle.
Yeah, you said it beautifully. I guess the Indian leaders, they need to listen to this and, understand that they need to learn from their mistakes. So, yeah, last questions. Now that you have stepped away from the city office, how do you see your role in shaping the global conversation on sustainable and inclusive mobility?
I do think, though, that there's a lot of people like myself in the world, and it is a smaller community than we think of. The world is smaller than we think. And that sort of knowledge and that sort of experience has to be mainstreamed now. It's about time we mainstream it. We cannot go any longer but by not speaking up when there are huge development plans or urban plans that are not what we all know should be. And I think that our voices tend to be viewed as technical, and they're not. Urban planning is a political issue. Urban planning is more political than any other livability issue. Not even health, is as political as urban planning, because urban planning includes everything that has to deal with life and everyday life. And so because it is a political issue, we should become more political. So if that's a short answer for you, but yes, not just me, but everybody who has been in the shoes and who has experience of cities that went through transformative time and a developing stage should share that with so many thousands and thousands of cities who are now not just transforming, but also growing at a pace where that growth has to match the knowledge and the right criteria of development, because it's very easy to do the same mistakes. There's currently, as we speak, cities who are building highways in the middle of the city, and that cannot be. We cannot stay silent against that. That is the destruction of generations of kids who are growing in separated cities. That's the destruction of community. That's isolation. That is money. That's gonna just go burn itself and has to be undone, and all efforts of undoing mistakes that we can avoid now. And I think that that's my message to everybody who is in this line of work, or is exiting it, or has experience in it, or is entering it. We should all become more political and advocate for this. Not a technical issue. This is not an architect's job. This is a political job.
You rightfully said it and accepted that this is urban planning is a political issue. Anuela, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and reflections with us
You.
today.
Thank you.
Your leadership, yeah,
Thank you.
your
I enjoyed
leadership
it
in
a lot.
yeah, okay. Yeah. Your leadership in Tirana shows what happens when city governments put people first, designing for children, for women, and for communities instead of just cars and concrete. For those of us in India where walkability and safety are often afterthoughts, your story is a reminder that change is possible when leaders have the courage to think it differently. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to all our listeners for tuning into the Human City podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. What resonated with you and what you would like us to explore next. You can send your feedback and guest suggestions to the given email ID. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify so you never miss an episode and can continue learning how cities can truly serve people, not just infrastructure. And finally, please share this episode with a friend, a colleague, or anyone who you think would benefit from these ideas. Together, we can spark more conversations about building cities that are inclusive, sustainable, and humane. I'm Ruchita Bansal, and this was the Human City podcast. See you in the next episode. Thank you.